Zamorano's biodiversity affects the economy, activity in the communities around the institution. So now we have to talk with you because you are an expert, and we want to do some questions about this topic.
Okay.
First, why do you think that it's important that the people in the world know about
the way
biodiversity?
that they benefit from biodiversity? But as we see in class, there are many, many ways that people are benefiting, so it's a great question. I guess people are benefiting in many ways, such as the use of materials that they get from the environment, like wood. Everything made of wood comes from trees. Trees are biodiversity, and trees are components of biodiversity. Even when you buy a chair or a desk, it may not be coming from a tree in your neighborhood, but it was made somehow with wood. So where did that wood come from? And how was it grown? Was it from a plantation or from a wild forest? And if it was from a wild forest, is that forest being destroyed in order to make the chair that we sit on? Those are important questions. And why is it important for us to have reserves of natural forest for everybody? Because it helps regulate climate, it helps generate oxygen, it reduces carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if we don't control those general aspects of our atmosphere, we all
suffer the consequences, right? Is that enough of an answer for you?
Yes.
Okay.
And what is the actual situation of biodiversity in Zamorano University?
Okay. Do you refer to all of the property that the university has, or the campus?
No, all the property that the university.
Okay. Well, a large part of our properties are covered by natural forest. And so we have a lot of biodiversity. And even where we don't have natural forests, such as in the valley, in the campus, in the fields and farms around the valley and down to the river, which is very, very intervenido en español, or it's been very much affected by human activities. It doesn't look like a natural environment anymore. But even in these disturbed environments, there are huge numbers of natural species and wild species. So there's a lot of diversity if you compare Zamorano, the property, the campus, the university, to many other places in the world. Why is there so much diversity here? Because we are in the middle of a biodiversity hotspot. Okay. We're in the middle of a biodiversity hotspot called the Mesoamerican Biodiversity Hotspot, which is a large area from central Mexico to Panama. But this part of the world has some of the highest levels of biodiversity in terms of tree species and other kinds of vegetation species, and then all the other kinds of species that go with that, so insects and birds and mammals and amphibians and reptiles. Central America in general is one of the areas in the world with the highest levels of biodiversity, the highest number of species. And so even if we have disturbed habitats here in the valley, we can see huge numbers of species, which is great for lots of things. You know, it helps maintain agricultural pests low, for example. There aren't huge problems with agricultural pests like there are in some temperate areas. And it's also nice for ecotourism. If you like to look at biodiversity, there's plenty of things to look at.
Okay, thank you. And what are the important benefits of the biodiversity in the agriculture?
Benefits of biodiversity to agriculture. Okay, very good. Well, agriculture depends on soil, right? The value of soil, like the productivity of soil, the contents of the soil, whether it's good for growing crops, has a lot to do with how the soil has been treated by biodiversity. So, for example, if we have earthworms in the soil, or snails, or lots of other kinds of microbes or different species of biodiversity, it helps enrich the soil, fertilize the soil for growing things. So there's a big difference between soil that has no biodiversity and soil that has a lot of biodiversity. The soil that has a lot of biodiversity is very good for growing crops. And when there's no biodiversity in the soil, then you have to add a lot of fertilizers.
And for example, the bees
right.
have the
Bees.
importance in the agriculture. For example, if there is no...
Some agriculture requires pollination, not all agriculture, but bees are a great way to pollinate crops, and sometimes there are wild bees that help pollinate crops. And here at Zamorano, we actually have honey production, and we maintain bee colonies, which generate honey, but they also pollinate the crops. So that's something positive. But the bees that we have are actually domestic bees. They're similar to the wild bees, but they're kind of cultivated themselves. It would be an interesting research question to determine to what extent the crops in Zamorano benefit from natural pollination. I don't know the answer. That would be a very interesting research question. Oh, there's more to that question. A lot more, because there's also the role of birds in controlling insects that could become pests if there weren't many birds. There are a lot of birds on campus, a lot of flycatchers that eat insects. The birds are helping to control the populations of things like cockroaches and beetles and mosquitoes. And also bats. There's a lot of bats on campus. They live in the buildings and the roofs, and they eat a lot of mosquitoes. So if we didn't have bats and birds, we'd have a lot more bugs, and that might be a nuisance, like a pest, a nuisance for all of us.
Okay. How do you evaluate the importance of biodiversity in the agriculture, and what techniques do you use?
I'll answer that later. Say that again.
How do you evaluate the importance of biodiversity in the agriculture, and what techniques do you use?
How do we evaluate the importance of biodiversity in agriculture, and what techniques do you use? That's a very, very good question. Who made these questions? Did you write these questions?
Yes.
Excellent questions. Well, it's not easy. It's not easy to do. And actually, I think you just read a paper about how to do that, right? In class. You can create experiments and enclosure experiments, for example, and see if you exclude, for example, the activity of birds and bats, what happens to but you let insects in and out. What happens to the plantation? How much folivory? How much do the insects eat the leaves of the plants if we exclude the birds and the bats? You can create these experiments and actually see quantitatively or quantify the degree to which the natural biodiversity is helping control pests. So it takes a lot of field work. It's not that easy to do. But you can also, I guess from a more preliminary or superficial way, we can document the biodiversity that's here and learn just what types of biodiversity are present. For example, with soil, we could go out and collect soil samples and look and see how much biodiversity is in the soil. That's something that I've never done, and I don't know if anybody has done that. And I know that the university applies fertilizers to the soil, but I don't know if they need to. It would be an interesting thesis project to evaluate the soil biodiversity, and also to look for whether there are certain parts of the university that have good soil biodiversity and others that don't, and if it has to do with how long a field has been under use. Because in agriculture, you plant in a field for a certain amount of time, then you let it rest for a certain amount of time. And the idea of letting it rest is to recover the biodiversity and the natural quality of the soil, right? Let the biodiversity do its work to recover the productivity of the soil. But there are also some kinds of agriculture where you just keep growing stuff and putting fertilizer and growing stuff, and you don't wait for the soil to recover on its own. So it would be interesting to look at Zamorano agricultural practices, look at the history of the plots, for example, where they grow the beans and corn. How much time do they let it rest? And are there differences? Do they do the same management for all the plots, or are there some plots where it never rests? And then compare the soil diversity in the different treatments of agricultural plots. Too much answers.
There's three more.
Okay.
What can the professionals and students do for saving biodiversity and increase agriculture at Zamorano?
What can students do to?
Professionals and students do for saving.
What can we do to save biodiversity and increase agricultural production? Okay, good question. Well, I guess one thing we can do to save biodiversity is to identify areas of the campus that should become biodiversity reserves. And I can give you a very specific example. Along the Rio Yaguare, there are areas where the agriculture comes very close to the river. And those areas, although they are good for production, they probably should be converted into a no-grow zone to conserve the water in the river, to protect the water in the river and let the river function as a biodiversity corridor. So, for example, there's in La Vega, no sé, you know La Vega? We have a high-intensity plot very close to the river, and also there's an area on a little bit further up downstream where we have a horse pasture or a cattle pasture that comes very close to the river. We also have a citrus plantation that comes very, very close to the river. In all of those areas, we could increase the corridor that protects the river from the agriculture, maybe by another 50 meters, let it grow back to forest, and we'll have a nice little biodiversity reserve that functions as a biological corridor, and the agrochemicals that are used in the plantations won't get to the river as much as they do, so that will protect the water quality in the river. And by having more biodiversity in that corridor, that should reduce the effect of possible pests in the agricultural production.